This is episode 138 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Kind of bringing back an issue we discussed last summer with regard to the merger, potentially, kind of almost playfully, but with a serious kernel of real policy in there, the merger of Aggie and Lobo football. Now, things have not gone particularly well for either the Aggies or the Lobos since we had that idea put forth in the local media and in a policy brief. Aggies are 0-7. They got trounced by Alabama and Washington State, to name a few. The Lobos managed to squeak out a win against a football subdivision. That means a lower division, Sam Houston State. They also had the fortune of playing the New Mexico State Aggies and picking up a win with them. And, of course, they went to Notre Dame and got throttled. Unfortunately for the Lobos, the rest of their opponents on their schedule have a winning record, and it's going to be very difficult for them to win even one of those games remaining this season. Now, why is this all something we want to rehash? Well, we're not rehashing anything. Since we had that discussion, the governor's proposed so-called quote-unquote free college. Free college tuition plus fees. And one of the main funding mechanisms for college athletics is student fees. Now, what incentive will there be at UNM or NMSU to run a tight ship, to manage your sports programs, if suddenly you have a direct line to the taxpayer bottom line of the state of New Mexico? Answer, not very much.
Not very much at all. And this is this whole tuition and fees discussion is in a system, the college funding system, that has students getting out of college with tens of thousands of dollars of debt, whether their chosen field of study and degree has any economic value or not. And over the past couple of decades, college costs have risen much quicker than inflation. They are certainly not a high value. And people are even starting to question the value of college in increasing numbers of degrees. Throw all of this into the mix, and you do have a very interesting question. And so the whole thing, tuition and fees have a broader use in the college funding scheme, particularly in public colleges, used for things like, as you said, college athletics. So if you are an art history major, some of your money that you're giving to, whether it be UNM, New Mexico State, or any other college, state college you go to in New Mexico, goes for athletic programs typically. And, and it's one of those things, is that right? Is that fair? And your point is, does that provide just these really perverse incentives in terms of making good decisions with regard to managing sports programs at all?
And of course, the playing field is shifting as we speak, Wally, with California allowing student athletes to gain endorsement deals, increasing talk of paid student athletes at some of these major programs, although that really is a can of worms that we don't have the time to get into. There will be legislation introduced by a Republican to offer students here in New Mexico the ability to cash in on endorsement deals. You've got the Alabamas, you've got the Ohio States, you've got a handful of what you'd call profitable semi-pro college teams, and then you've got those that barely squeak by, the Lobos and Aggies among them, but certainly falling into the majority of college football programs that either don't turn a profit or really are reliant on the combined subsidy of taxpayers and students in the form of fees. So this whole situation with regard to college athletics is changing quickly, but with the governor putting forth free college tuition and fees, I think this conversation needs to come to the top of the agenda in this area, because the last thing we need, the taxpayers, is college athletic programs getting fat and happy on the backs of so-called free college tuition and fee payments, thanks to oil and gas and the governor's program.
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, it's an issue New Mexico ought to take very, very seriously. But this whole wild card that's being dealt with regard to paying of players, what that would mean, we already have a situation where there's a number of elite schools at the start of the year, somewhere between 5 and 15 that fairly regularly have an opportunity to be national championship. And they're the ones that everyone wants on TV. They're the ones that are the money-making schools. And then there's a kind of occasional group that occasionally goes into that top group. And then there's a lot of schools, UNM and New Mexico State, even when New Mexico State has its best year in recent history 2 years ago, 500 during the year, 6-6, and then win a bowl game to go 7-6. There's still light years from that top echelon where the money flows like milk and honey into the programs from the private sector, from TV deals, from others. That's just not the case in a small, sparsely populated state like New Mexico that really doesn't have the history and tradition of, 40,000 fans at a football game like in Lincoln, Nebraska, or, Alabama, where it's basically the biggest show in the entire state. That's not what we have. Maybe Lobo basketball was that at one point, certainly not the football programs.
Yeah, and that's a whole different discussion. Lobo basketball, at least if they did something with their athletic program, taking the same resources, dedicating it to a basketball program that's been competitive, could put them into a higher level than where they are right now. But boy, they are light years away from, not just Alabama, but even the middle tier schools that often compete for major bowl games. It's just not realistic right now, no matter how many resources we pour into the system. And I think we have to have a real conversation about that, especially within this free college context. Now, Wally, Rio Grande Foundation, as you and many listeners are aware, we fought the good fight on sick leave or paid leave at the county, Bernalillo County. They passed it. And now we are dealing with, if you want, the aftermath of that whole situation, which is we filed a lawsuit, and now we are playing games with Bernalillo County, or more appropriately, they are playing games with us in terms of open records, in terms of communications with county commissioners, Hart Stebbins, O'Malley, Piscotti, on emails, text messages, things that are public records. We filed a records request back on June 21st, trying to find out who's communicating with who, what special interest groups like Olay and El Centro are having to do with this paid leave proposal. We have gotten a runaround. It is ridiculous. The lawsuit is still out there. We filed that back on August the 9th. They found allegedly 11,000 new records, but they haven't actually produced them. We've been delayed, saying that it's broad and burdensome. It is very frustrating to deal with these government officials. They are clearly up to something.
They are up to something, and it's generally no good. The fact that it's 11,000, I would suspect, and I don't know if you have any information about how many of those might be emails, but, to the extent that any of those are emails, that's the easiest kind of record to one, search, two, transmit to somebody. I mean, you can put it on thumb drives, you can put it on Dropbox, Hightail. There's services to, those could be easily, one, searched, two, screened, and three, transmitted, usually in a matter of minutes or hours. It's crazy that it's gone on this long. So yes, there is something not right in River City, or in this case, River County, New Mexico, Bernalillo County, with regard to this issue.
Well, considering that the Rio Grande Foundation and numerous other organizations on both sides of the issue when it came to paid sick leave or paid leave, considering that was an email campaign kind of situation where both sides were getting their bases and, presumably concerned citizens engaged in contacting their county commissioners, I would imagine that maybe 10 of the 11,000 communications would be emails, so 10,000 out of 11,000, or maybe even a higher percentage. So whatever it is, you're right. It's inexcusable. Unfortunately, New Mexico's open records law, the IPRA, does not have as many teeth as we would like. It certainly doesn't bite as quickly as you would like in order to achieve results. It's kind of like spanking your kid. I hate to get into that discussion as a parent, but if they put their hand up on the stove when it's going, there is, I think, a very reasonable case to be made for that kind of punishment of spanking, because you associate the pain of the spanking with not touching or touching lightly the pan on the stove, whereas waiting 3 weeks or a month before you punish your kid, or even a couple of hours, and saying this is for that stove, an hour, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, that does nobody any good. You've got to have it right there when the issue is happening. And so what I assume they're doing is trying to run out the clock, and nobody will pay attention or care by the time they release all of these records. And this is kind of par for the course for our government here in New Mexico, especially a local government.
Well, and my close, if not to my final thought on the issue is, when they initially came back with virtually no emails, when the groups asking for the IPRA request knew they sent many, many emails. It's like, are they ignorant? Are they apathetic? They don't know and they don't care, but you're trying to get them to care. Hopefully they will do so. If they don't like the IPRA statute, I guess you could try to have it overturned in Santa Fe, but that does not seem like the way in our democratic representative form of government that it's good. It's not good at the state level. It's not good at the national level. It's certainly not good at the county and local level.
Right. And, Wally, we're going to talk a little bit about the ballots, especially here in Albuquerque. The election is coming up very quickly, but one issue that we wanted to address that was reported on this week is, of course, the Keller administration is asking voters to approve a bond question of $128.5 million in total, but $14 million of which would go to a centralized homeless shelter. Now, we've talked about homelessness. We know homelessness is a real issue, although I think there's a lot of questions about homeless policies in some of our major cities. Certainly mental health is an issue, but also, is it just the fact that that is the easiest way for a lot of people to get money, hanging out on the streets, being able to do the drugs and do everything they want to do and all the behavior where they don't have any accountability, checking into a shelter or trying to, get free of drugs, because a lot of these shelters do have those restrictions. So,
well, this is to say this is a difficult issue. It's just, it's tough to come up with clear policies that you think would have an impact, or it had an impact everywhere. As you said, mental illness, drug abuse, the fact that in some cases there are people that basically are abusing the system. There was an article within the past couple of weeks in the Santa Fe New Mexican that they think that people from Albuquerque are riding the rail runner to Santa Fe to basically panhandle because the pickings are better. And my first thought is, well, finally somebody's riding the rail runner to Santa Fe. But then once that fleeting thought left my mind, it was like, well, that just shows that is that's how complicated this issue is.
Well, hold on, Wally. I gotta say, because I know that it's common practice in a lot of cities, and I think they've done it in Albuquerque too, to provide transportation to other neighboring cities for homeless to get them away. And
But that's a one-way trip, not
Exactly.
not a commuter pass, if you will.
fair enough. But
Yes.
in the case of city buses, though, I think
Yeah.
you'd be just, this is a common thing to see homeless people essentially spending their entire days on the city buses. The Rail Runner, I haven't seen that as much, but they may be. And where I'm going with all of this is that we just came off of the balloon fiesta. And again, this stuff comes up and I'm thinking about it and talking about it, but I don't know if anybody in this city missed the obvious decline in the number of people panhandling at local intersections. The homeless presence was way, way down in the city of Albuquerque for the week plus of Balloon Fiesta. Now, what were they doing during that time frame to make it seem like there was much less of a problem? Are those kinds of policies that we see for 1 week a year to make us look nice for all the tourists, is that a realistic way to do things? Because my point in bringing this entire thing up is that the headline is Mayor, Homeless Advocates Clash Over Plan for Centralized Shelter. And we've already said on this podcast that I don't think that even if you build this thing, it's, Field of Dreams. If you build it, will they come? Well, I don't think the homeless are going to come to this shelter when they aren't going to the shelters that already are in existence. But the fact is that something was done in the city of Albuquerque during the Balloon Fiesta to clean up, to make the homeless issue less apparent. I don't know what the benefits and the drawbacks of these policies were, what was actually going on, because they didn't tell us. But clearly, there was a significant change in the homeless situation for that week.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I agree with you. So yes, could that, whatever that was, would that be one, legal, two, feasible for the other 51 weeks a year? I don't know.
In the immortal words of When Harry Met Sally, I'll have what she's having.
Exactly.
But for homeless, yes.
Okay, now another data point just that I came across recently in a trip to Durango, Colorado. Stayed with some people up there, and Durango, as cold as it is in the winter, has more of a homeless population that is there year round than you would think. And the discussion there was they opened a fantastic soup kitchen. It was very good. People liked it, and guess
Is this
what?
where you were dining in Durango? Wally, is your secret out?
I have to.
Cheap eats in Durango. Wally's going to put out a tour guide.
Exactly. But they brought more people in because that facility was there. So it's one of those, okay, what are we doing with that? The other issue they struggled with is a while back, they allowed there to be, for the entire community, free ridership on their bus and van system. So no external. They absolutely know it costs money and the city was paying for it. But in that case, during the winter months, as you alluded to here in Albuquerque, the homeless were basically taking a seat on the bus the minute it opened up in the morning, 6, 7 o'clock, riding that thing all day. It's cold in the winter in Durango. And so you get these unexpected issues. And I had talked to a city council candidate a number of months ago who was out doing some work and talking to the homeless that were kind of in and around the shelters that existed about why they were here and how they got here, where they were from. And he said many of them were sent here from other communities, the proverbial one-way bus ticket from somewhere else. And they said, well, why did you take that? He said, because they really sold Albuquerque as a place that was really good to the homeless. You ought to take this bus ticket and go there. And so, that does not seem like that's the, human services version of cities bidding on stadiums. We're going to give you this much money, except in reverse. It's like we're going to spend all of our homeless money to send them to San Diego. It doesn't seem like that's a good systemic throughout the country approach to things, but it's interesting. We might be on the short end of that as well relative to some other communities around the country right now.
Well, without trying to solve a very complicated problem in a very simple, short time period here, I think we need to make sure that the homeless people that come here are not coming here because of the largesse of the community and the freebies that they are getting. And we also need to educate the local population, whether they're breaking the law or not, providing folks with money by giving them cash at intersections is definitely not the way to improve their lives in the long term. And those are two simple solutions I think we could be able to achieve if we got serious about this issue for the other 51 weeks of the year besides Balloon Fiesta. Wally, speaking of a place that deals with lots of homeless issues, California, I was on a family trip with the kiddos, good old Disneyland, the fun of visiting all those exciting destinations.
The happiest place on earth.
You know, and the kids had a great time. But I tell you what, it's not the happiest place on earth is a gas pump in the state of California. Gas around there, you could find in Los Angeles, we drove around a fair amount, you could find gas prices below $4 a gallon, but it was tough. The average price was about $4.20 to $4.30. And I have a picture that we actually filled up at a 76 gas station where the regular unleaded price was $4.39, the premium $4.63. And don't think you diesel people get out cheap, $4.19 per gallon of diesel fuel. At the same time, we were seeing stories on the local news in LA about fires, and in Northern California, PG&E was dealing with their own fire issue by shutting people's electricity off. 750,000 homes and businesses across 34 counties in Northern California predominantly were literally just blacked out. The utility was not providing electricity because of the Santa Ana winds and the potential for a down power line causing a out of control fire that would essentially destroy the utility, because it's very complicated, but they've actually found that these utilities, unless they really, really manage the area underneath those power lines, they fall down and boom, a fire happens, and suddenly they're on the hook for tens of billions of dollars in expenses. So very, very interesting situation just in the last week going on in California in terms of things that we take for granted, like electricity, but also the ability to get around in an automobile. And $4.39 a gallon. Ouch, when Albuquerque is about $2.39 a gallon at the same exact time period.
Yeah, it is very interesting. And then there are reasons for that, and the overwhelming majority of them in California's case are self-inflicted. They have higher taxes than a place like New Mexico. They have extremely small geographic zones of gasoline formulation, meaning they will make gasoline producers tweak their formula very slightly from one basin to the other. So there's lots of little boutique amounts of gasoline that make it harder to manage the system. But I do have a observation on the turning off the electricity anytime the wind blows near a tree. I worked in the utility industry many, many years ago. And so the whole issue of tree trimming is trees grow. It's a never ending process. But if this fire and the potential of fire is going to be a huge issue, in New Mexico, I'm not sure that a PNM is going to have the issue as much for a few reasons. One, most of their transmission lines and power lines don't go through the forests and other areas that tend to burn a lot. But the rural electric co-ops, particularly those in mountainous areas, you just drive any kind of rural or forest area road and you see power lines and you see trees overhanging, trees above the lines, trees below. If they're ever exposed to this kind of liability, you could have the power off in mountain communities, a fourth of the time potentially, or required, literally hundreds of millions, if not more dollars to do an adequate amount of tree trimming. But guess what? It's in the forest, a lot of that, and there will be environmental impact studies and other things required. So I think that this is a burgeoning issue that is going to see a lot of attention, and I suspect it'll grow and get, my prediction, it'll get totally out of hand until there's some sort of federal legislation to address it. And like a lot of things that are both good and a lot of things that are bad from a government and a management point of view, guess where it happened first? California.
You got it. And it'll be interesting to see how this situation plays itself out, because California is going to be dealing with hot, dry weather and those winds, the Santa Ana winds. They're rough. They are really strong when they come through. They did one of the nights we were there. Wally, real quick, we've got a couple of final items. APS's Superintendent Raquel Reedy cashed in her big 11% pay increase, just the latest in a stretch of significant pay increases, and then she retires. Simple vehicle for her and other government officials to spike the value of their pension. She is, of course, in the ERB, Education Retirement Board. She'll be receiving a very nice pension long into the future because of that situation. And, $257,000 annually, her pension will be quite nice. We are going to look into exactly how much that pension will be, but I believe it's on the order of 75 or so % of her pay. So she's going to be getting, for doing nothing, for sitting home in retirement, on the order of $100,000+ in terms of that pension. So very nice work if you can get it. She didn't do much for the district in terms of improving its student outcomes, but she also didn't have any lawsuits filed against her. And I think that was what they were looking for. It's the maybe not empty suit, but somebody who could fill that spot without creating undue attention, legal problems for the school district, which is pretty sad that is where APS is at this point.
Yes. Very, very interesting. I'm anxious to see that calculation. Most pensions have your retirement based on your highest 3 years or 5 years or whatever it is. And so, I'm anxious to see that. But it was, not a surprise that she took that raise, but boy, was that inarticulately handled.
Oh, it looks terrible. Yeah.
Well, and the fact that you never knew whether she got it or not. They, you know what I mean? They said, well, she might have gotten it, and then they didn't do a press release or just said, yes, she took it at the time it happened. It had to kind of trickle out later, which, really adds to, the air of cronyism in government. And believe me, there's no doubt that, the public schools are government, no two ways around that.
And in a case of kind of a group being taken advantage of and us just sitting back and kind of laughing at the whole situation, is the Greater Albuquerque Hotel and Lodging Association. These guys, a lot of the hotel owners, and they're forced, if you own a hotel, you have to have this tax charged to your guests.
Lodger's tax, right?
Yeah, lodger's tax.
Right.
They have to charge it, even if you're just a mom and pop hotel, you don't want to have anything to do with this. But because of the way this dynamic is, you have to pay the tax, or your customers have to pay the tax. So long story short, the Lodging Association gets together and they convince public officials, city council, et cetera, to levy this tax on their own customers, which seems a little counterintuitive. But then they say, well, we're going to dedicate this money to making New Mexico, or the city of Albuquerque in this case, a more attractive destination for tourism. And then now we see where the city council has just passed what you would call maybe far-fetched ways of using these dollars that were generated by this tax and putting them to say, refurbishing softball fields that are not managed well at Eubank and the interstate, the park there, which we posted some pictures of the homeless situation there. So maybe it's not just the management of the fields themselves, but the entire infrastructure and the tackling of the homeless issue. But I digress. Ultimately, the folks at the Greater Albuquerque Lodgers Association, Jim Thompson and Michelle Dressler wrote this op-ed. Basically, they were not consulted, I know, for their beloved money being put aside ostensibly for their industry's benefit, the taxes that their customers paid. How do we get more people to visit Albuquerque? And then, you know what? City council and the mayor just didn't pay attention to them. They got that those tax dollars in their grubby little fingers, and then they did whatever the heck they darn well pleased with that money.
And I would say that in my my observation over the years, that is the way government works. So you will justify a new tax or a new fee because it's going to go to something, whether it be for the children, or in this case, you as lodgers can support this tax on your customers because we're going to reinvest it in advertising to bring more tourists to our town. But then over time, it shifts. It shifts very subtly, and it goes another way. Now, there are some of these sort of configurations. Some are voluntary, and some the industry assesses it on its own members. But this is a government tax. This brought to mind for me, Paul, a few years ago, there were some that were proposing a similar type of a tax on oil producers to send money to Santa Fe to educate people on all the wonderful things that oil and gas did for New Mexico. But in the first draft out of the box, so it's like, okay, yeah, we can charge the oil and gas industry more money, or they can do it voluntarily. But in the first draft out of the box of the legislation, it's like, well, 1/3 of it needs to go for wind education, and the rest needs to go for this, and the rest needs to go for that. And, we've seen this with other types of taxes and money that comes into the government. The Tobacco Settlement Fund was designated for smoking cessation. They basically blew through that, and it was used for whatever. So this is not common, but if you're a lodger, if you're charging your customers pay a higher price because of this. And believe me, that has an impact. All things being equal, that has a definite cost to you running a hotel, motel, or whatever. And then to have the money put to places that are way different than what it was, I think I would be upset if I were in that industry as well.
Yeah, $30.5 million, and projects include revamping Los Altos Park. I'm sure it's a huge tourist destination. You hear constantly people coming here and saying, I'm going to Los Altos Park. Yeah, I know some people do. There's softball tournaments, et cetera,
Oh, yeah.
et cetera,
I mean, you can always make an argument
yes.
for the barest sliver of this. Yes. No, I mean, there's always an argument, but is it really substantive? Is that really the real story?
A new soccer stadium also. These are things that by and large are going to benefit average Albuquerqueans, and that's fine. I'm an Albuquerquean. I don't care as much about bringing tourism in here, but this is the problem you have when you entrust government with your money, or the money of your customers in this case, and you expect that you're going to have some say in how that money is used. But because they are government, they do not care. They will do whatever they darn well please. And sorry for the folks at the Hotel and Lodgers Association, because they learned a lesson that they probably should have learned some time ago. That is the way the cookie crumbles. Wally, it is right around the corner that we are having an election in the city of Albuquerque, municipal elections. It's a very new process, a lot of changes this time around. You'll notice, of course, that the election is not in October or March. For school board, that was often the case. We are in November, at least the election, although early voting starts this coming Saturday. And that's why we are sitting down to have a discussion about some of the most important issues on this fall's ballots. Now, this is kind of a special episode. We have discussed at some length the Democracy Dollars proposal. Simply put, this is another method of giving left-wing special interest groups additional control over local elections. It's public financing on steroids, $25 vouchers handed out to any quote-unquote resident of Albuquerque, whether they're illegally here, whether they're a young person, a kid. We don't know whether they're registered to vote or not. All of these things make this a really, really bad idea. But Wally, as usual, there are many bad ideas on local election ballots. And so we're going to go through a lot of them, especially bond issues and whatnot.
Yeah. This Democracy Dollars, you are forced through higher taxes to pay for this, whether you want it or not. And it has huge overhead in administration, a bad policy all the way around. But let's get to what are people going to be voting on and what are their choices coming up?
So, of course, they'll have school board, and those are important races, especially for Albuquerque Public Schools. We know that district, the dominating factor has been fealty to the unions. And Peggy Muller-Aragon, she's my school board member. She has been a thorn in the side of the union. She's facing a union-sponsored opponent. I think that's a really critical race because of all the issues going on at Albuquerque Public Schools. And are we going to just go down the path of the unions totally controlling that entire school board or not? But of course, Albuquerque Public Schools is looking for more of our money, $290 million worth, 2 different ballot measures on the ballot. Will voters approve this without the requisite increase in taxes that we would have seen if they'd gone along with the January ballot election that APS pushed? I don't know. But the fact is that turning down bond measures or turning down tax increases only get you so far. You need a board that is willing to make changes. And we can't endorse candidates at the Rio Grande Foundation, but if you like APS, the way it's operating, think they're doing a fine and dandy job, then get rid of Peggy Muller-Aragon. If you think they need a voice of reform and maybe even more voices like her, I think she's somebody who is going to be a voice for reform. You may not be aware that there is a 0.25% tax on the ballot. That tax is a renewal of a transportation gross receipts tax. So this, if you reject it as a voter, if voters reject it, tax rates will go down by 0.25%. 38% of that tax is spent on transit projects. We know that the bus system in this town is being used by fewer and fewer people. We know that this is not an ideal mechanism for funding our transportation system. It'd be great to see voters, for a change, turn down one of these renewals of a tax.
If you're not frustrated with transportation issues relative to taxes and projects in Albuquerque right now, there may never be a tax that you would vote no for. So the people I talk to just across the city, and it's interestingly gotten to be a statewide and increasingly a national issue. People ask me from other places, hey, aren't you the one that has that weird bus thing that didn't work? So yeah, I think that one has a chance to be voted down, and I think that would certainly send a strong message about the frustration with the ART project.
No doubt about it, but we shall see. There's no organized campaign on either side of that issue so far as I can tell. Now, we're going to talk about a few bonds. Bonds are a way that government takes on debt and pays for various things. Some of this is absolutely useful. Some of it is not. One problem with all bonds in the city of Albuquerque is that 1% of the money is diverted to, I use this quote, ART, not the ART rapid transit system.
Lowercase ART,
yes,
art projects.
But I'd still use those quotation marks because the artistic nature of those is very open to interpretation. I live near off of Coors Boulevard on the west side, and there is a quote unquote art sculpture there where it involves like essentially metal fence posts, and they form kind of a wave mechanism. It's just baffling to me, some of the things that our betters in local government view as art. But of course, with 1% of all these bond proceeds being allocated to art, just opens the question, when is enough in terms of the money available for art? Now, $5 million is the amount of a housing bond alone that's on the fall ballot. So $50,000 of that one will be diverted to pay for quote unquote art. That is true for all of the various bond measures. I think it's time to consider eliminating this 1% for the arts within all of our bond measures.
Yeah, and I believe, isn't that a state law, or is it a state law with a local option? Because I've heard about this 1% a lot of places, but I'm not real sure, to tell you the truth. But the bottom line is it is a lot of money. And just to show you what can go wrong, the one Albuquerque sculpture that was put together, somebody didn't do their math, and the sculpture was too heavy to put on Civic Plaza where they wanted to put it, because Civic Plaza is on top of a parking structure, and it was not designed for that. It could come crashing down below. In addition, it wasn't friendly towards the handicap, because like on the left side, it's 3 lines, one Albuquerque and then Urquí below.
Burke there.
And then, but you could reach out with your cane if you were blind, think nothing's there, and run right into the middle. So there have been, just when you think art is something that even government, how could they mess it up? Here's an example of how they did.
Exactly. There's number of other bonds, a general obligation for senior, family, community center. One of the additional problems, I might add, is that now we're dealing with summaries. Summaries are on the ballot, and so they make these summaries sound as mom and apple pie as you can imagine. But this one is a $21.7 million bond. Money will be diverted from that to fund the new homeless shelter, centralized shelter that even advocates have concerns about. That homeless shelter is $14 million in total. Energy and water conservation sounds mom and apple pie, $10.4 million. Of course, you've probably seen the solar panels going up all across town, $3.85 million diverted to so-called renewable energy projects at city facilities. Metro redevelopment, $8 million. That's the total cost of the bond. $5 million of that would go to the proposed rail yards redevelopment, which is estimated to cost between $50 and $80 million just to prepare the site. So
that would be the ante into the game to get that redeveloped.
Yeah, that's
and
a
yet
long way.
And yet it's still $5 million.
Well, of course, they're trying to get money from the state because the state is swimming in cash thanks to oil and gas. Affordable housing, there's $5 million for homeless facility in that as well. C&M wants $84 million, $7 million of which is for film industry related training. And then APS, again, we've just got so many people asking for our hard-earned dollars. It is time the city voters took a skeptical view towards these efforts to get a hold of more of our money.
Yeah, and I have not seen anything from C&M. $84 million, even in the city of Albuquerque. That's a pretty hefty sum. And like you say, where's the details on that? That is just a lot of money. I'm not saying it's not a great project, well spent. What is it for? It's not been widely reported, that's for sure.
All right. Well, that is our quick explanation of some of the issues and concerns we have on the ballot this fall. Be sure to take a look. By all means, please vote, and especially go ahead and vote early. It's important you get your voice heard. Thanks for listening to this week's podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point, New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post your comments on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point, New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.